want to bring you back to the John Henry story, because it seems to me that the John Henry story exactly undoes much of what Kathleen is saying. And by that I mean that there is a certain durability that is built into the John Henry story about the persistence of human spirit, of aspirations, of connectivity, that suggests that despite the ascent of technology, we're still very much the same, and that as different technologies have come into the forefront of our attention, we have tried repeatedly, if we look at the Industrial Revolution and all of the technologies that have come to the forefront, we've tried repeatedly to argue that we're different. And yet we seem very much, I think, to be right in place. Despite the fact that there are blurred identities, there are ghettos of identity. Despite the fact that there's blurred boundaries between private and public, there are inaccessible, harshly inaccessible private spaces. So I guess my question is a bigger one, and it certainly builds off of what Bill is saying, but it rises to the what I would call the problematic spirit of technological determinism, which is, what is it about technology that keeps making us want to reinvent ourselves?
I think it's a great point. I think to the John Henry story, I don't know that the story is still resonant. I mean, which struck me when I've talked with my students, as I say, most of them say, that's ridiculous. You know, why would you sacrifice yourself? So I don't know whether that's true. Now, I do think, though, that you're right. Technology does seem to, not all technologies, but certain technologies do invite us to ask the question, you know, where are we? What are we doing? What is our role? And Kathleen and I were talking about sports as an example of the opposite of this, because we still do admire, and you know, the amount of discussion at Stanford, which presumably is a serious research university, about our football team and the heroics of this perfectly nice young man, Andrew Luck, seems very much non-21st century, and he's a lovely guy, but I mean, it seems very non-21st century. I mean, he runs around, he hits people, he throws a ball, you know, he wears a lot of pads, and yeah, it's so odd. And we both happen to like sports, so it's not that we don't like it, but it is very odd that that's what we do. And in fact, still more people like football than chess. I mean, even though the chess team is one we were exercised about. I mean.
But not to mention Penn State, which I probably shouldn't mention at this moment. So yeah, it's a very good question. I think my answer is it depends on whether you look at the glass half full or half empty. By the way, I think what's interesting about sports, it's not that physicality doesn't remain important, but it is placed in this realm of entertainment now. Not sort of survival of the species, so to speak. So I agree. Of course, I would be the first to say there are enduring human universals until an evolution, which might change that, takes a very long time. So I don't believe that those processes are evolutionary ones or biological ones. But I also feel that despite, or in the midst of human durability, of the universals of what we share, which I think are what we should look for in how we build our social worlds. But our social worlds aren't universal. Those are enormously diverse, and they can be more or less unequal. They can be more or less fair. They can be more or less just, depending on how we as human beings try to define those terms and enact them in our societies. So what interests me about change, well, change interests me at three levels. It interests me as a method, because I think it's a way to get at the ability of human beings and human societies to actually mold the world in different ways, despite what they share as human beings, or in terms of their human nature. Also because I think it enables us to, as theorists, to disentangle cause and effect. If it's all just the same and nothing ever changes, I think we're stuck in these notions that we can't really build theories about what affects what, or even one of the things that I think is fundamental to human beings is our desire to mold, to create. To try somehow, as we do in this room, to understand how something works in order to make a difference. So that's the other reason I'm interested in looking not just at what never changes, but what does, and how change is possible, and what directions change leads us in. And I guess the final thing is this issue of determinism. I believe in explanations, but I'm not a determinist, precisely because to me, what's amazing about humans is the malleability, the capacity we have to move back and forth between knowledge, impulse, and action. And not just the malleability of ourselves in certain social contexts, which is why we wanted to talk about the role of social context, but our own ability under the best of circumstances as groups and as individuals to somehow use that knowledge, not just to be molded, a la technological change, but to mold. I mean, to decide where we want to go, how we want to use those new capacities that this new era gives us, and those new dangers, because for me, change is always a mix of opportunity and danger.
Kathleen has posited that our institutional framework, and in particular perhaps our public policies, are out of whack with some of the main ways in which this larger transformation is taking place. So I'd like to ask each of you if there was one public policy you could change or institute that would somehow enable public policy to make life better, empower, make people happier in coping and adapting with this new world, what would that one change be, or what new policy?
Ooh. You go first.
I don't know that public policy is the right sphere to look at, and which is sort of coming from a spirit of technological determinism or the abdication of, I think to a large degree, public policy has made a decision, technology is marching on, and that's it. So I suppose the one change would be to really change that view. I remember in the 60s, Lang knew in his book, Autonomous Technology, and he was bemoaning the fact that, we just had this idea, if it's invented, you have to do it. And now I think that's become so much a part of the cultural ethos, not just the political ethos, that hearing parents say, well, look, my kid is going to do A, B, C, D, E, use the internet, use a cell phone, et cetera. So I think the political change would be technologies have to, in some sense, that society has the idea that we can stop them, which is really a change. In fact, if you look at the classic discussions of law and technology in the 1800s, it was this bemoaning that law was impeding technology and that law was just constantly impeding things. And, the problem now we have the exact opposite. Law has just said, I give up, whatever, just run ahead. And I think that's probably what it would be, an acceptance that, hey, technology isn't the boss. We're people. We get to win, at least until the robots take over the world or whatever. We win, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Hey, maybe maybe we disagree on something. I couldn't give you a specific policy, but because I think because specific policies are, as Bill was pointing out, about much more specific cause and effect relationships. But I do have kind of a general principle that, for me, that I think about as working and also being just, and it's one I talk about with my students, which is effective social, to me, this sounds kind of corny, but effective social policy to me is very much like the Reinhold Niebuhr aphorism or famous quote, God give me the wisdom to know what God give me the strength to accept the things I cannot change. Oh. I'm screwing it up. Which, right, thank you. God, give me the strength to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. And I think that is what good social policy is. Good social first and foremost, it can't try to do the impossible, to turn back the tide. I think that's what Cliff is saying. That is, and sadly, I think in many ways, that's where we as a nation are stuck right now. We're endlessly debating whether we think change is good or bad, and that rather than saying these are the fundamental aspects of change. Now, what should we do about them? But so once we recognize that, then we need to really focus on, okay, what are the things we have control over, and where do we want to get there? What kind of principles do we think apply here? I think those are really tough choices, because there's always, I've been asked, for example, to write about a utopian society, with respect to families and gender. And my response is always, one person's utopia is another person's hell. So I'm very reluctant to think about social policies as those which would impose one vision of the good society on everybody else, regardless of whether that was my vision. But I do think social policy should first have certain principles at stake, and one is empowerment. I trust people with the necessary resources, to build their own lives. But the second is justice and equality, that those resources need to be fairly and evenly distributed. And beyond those moral principles, I would like to see moralizing just get out of the way. But certainly in politics, I think, is inherently a moral pursuit, and in this society, we tend to moralize a great deal about these topics. But so I think we should be much clearer about not moralizing about the things that are beyond our control, and not passing judgment on others, but rather developing principles by which we can fairly distribute options and resources.
So I wanted to reflect on the John Henry story, because there's a dimension of it I don't think really has come into the conversation, which is it's got a racial context. And I think that what the John Henry story is telling us is a metaphor about the rules of the game changing for blacks when they have achieved something successful on a pre-existing set of rules. And so I guess it's not the machine per se that's the issue in that story. It's the fact that John Henry is a person of great accomplishment, whose capacity to continue to be a person of great accomplishment is being undermined by a change in the conditions. And I think that this also speaks to some of the comments that Kathy was making, because I'm not convinced that there is this incredible fluidity with respect to people's class positions. In fact, I think the best evidence, including some of the work that Gary Saxonhouse did years ago, suggests that the degree of social mobility has actually declined in the United States, and that there is an asymmetry, that people are more likely to go down than go up. So,
to be fair, that's what I was trying to say.
Okay,
but in a somewhat different way.
Okay,
Yeah.
But I think that intersects with the racialized dimension of the John Henry story, which is, again, another case where somebody who has reached the heights anticipates that he's not going to be able to stay at those heights because there's some change that's taking place to subvert the opportunities that he previously had. So, yeah.
I'm curious. I mean, I don't actually know the race of John Henry. I don't know it's mentioned in this.
He was a black man. I mean,
He was.
Critical dimension of the story.
Well, it's interesting because it's not in the song, right? It's at least not in the song, and it's the other interesting part of the story is that it's not clear whether his heroism is that he won, or his heroism is that he died after he won. He sacrificed his life for for this, but it's an interesting issue about what happens when the rules change. Right? It's really a rules change story, and I don't know. I'd have to really think about it. So, but it's to me the story reads not as a story of race, even though I certainly believe you as a black man. It is this story of, what does it mean to be an ennobled human? What does it mean to be a person who's ennobled, and what is a triumph, and who are you triumphing over? Right? Because as I say, in the 21st century, triumphing over a machine, it would be like, I can bake bread faster than a bread-making machine seems sort of silly. So it's interesting. I'm going to think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, let me respond very briefly to the point about class, because I don't think we're disagreeing with each other. While I do agree that probably for the sake of, making a strong point, I might have gone a little overboard. And certainly class and race are very intertwined, although we can also talk about class diversity among, among and between different races as well. And it's a very complicated story that we don't have time to get into here. But what I was trying to get at, and I certainly don't want to exaggerate it, is the fluidity and insecurity that now surrounds class position. So it doesn't, and I tried to say, it's not as if any new period negates the inequalities and the differences of the old period. It just sits on top of them. And I suppose what I see in this new period is both, great danger, that the problem with the rising insecurity, even among the middle class, is that it can produce a great deal of self-interested action that thinks about how can I survive in a difficult era. But it can also produce a sense of we're more in this together than we thought we were or that we once were. A great deal of what we used to think of as class inequality, by the way, back to the John Henry story, is the shift from manufacturing to service work, which I didn't have time to get. It was in my notes, but I had to skip over it. And because we tended to outsource so much of manufacturing jobs in this globalized marketplace, and Silicon Valley is a perfect example of that, class differences are increasingly in the society about the kind of service work someone does rather than whether one does white-collar or blue-collar work. And so there's intellectual and creative work, and then there's all of the other work that develops around it, which is care in a very broad way, not simply caring for other people's dependents and other people's children or your own children, but taking care of houses and lawns and restaurants and the like. So there's certainly an overlay of racial and ethnic differences that's part of that shift, which is a topic for another session, which I think is a really important one, but I don't think that it undermines the basic idea that with the rise of these much less predictable positions and economic statuses over time, we need to really think about what that implies for the ability of us as a society either to see each other, each person competing with the other versus we're in a similar situation and we need to develop more collective ways of providing security and not raising the stakes so high, providing safety nets. And I just want to underline, again, it's not just class and race, but so much of that is now intertwined with family and with the connections that we're either able to make or not make with other people, because we are not. Another irony of this era is we increasingly think of ourselves as sort of economic individualists. I have to take care of myself. I can't rely on these other more permanent long-term connections. On the other hand, our fate is increasingly tied up with the ways in which we come together as members of families, as people who are both kin and fictive kin, to help each other through the hard times. And when that support is there, then there is a safety net, and when it's not, there isn't. So there are a lot of really complicated issues here, and I didn't want to gloss over them, but I did want to raise them as something for us to think about.
Cliff, I think one of the important things about the John Henry song is who wrote it. Do you know who wrote it?
No.
Exactly, you don't. Exactly right. It's folk music, and the person who wrote that did not have to be discovered by Albert Grossman. Did not have to have a contract with Columbia Records. It emerged up from the bottom up, and what I see happening with digital media and social media today is that our culture is increasingly like folk music. You think about Flickr or Wikipedia. And this is in some ways a transformation that is, I think, equivalent in terms of the potential and the problems and challenges to the collapse of the former Soviet Union, where with that collapse, because there was a lack of development of civil society, there is a kind of vacuum when it happens. And it's difficult for new institutions to emerge that allow people to take control of their lives and interact in an effective way because of the vacuum that was created in a period of extended totalitarian rule. But what we're seeing now happening with media, we're moving from mass media to social media. It's not Britannica that writes the encyclopedia, it's thousands of individuals. It's not Hilton that decides where we spend the night. We get a room on couch surfing. We don't shop at Sears, we shop on eBay, where we're buying from an individual, not a product decided by a purchasing agent for Sears. And you can go, on down the list. When the earthquake struck in Virginia, the shockwave reached New York City faster on Twitter than it did through the plates, through the earth. And blogs, we don't have CBS or Walter Cronkite deciding what is news and opinion, or David Brooks this afternoon. We have blogs, we have Twitter. So there are all kinds of problems that come with that, for sure. And you could argue that the institutions that were top-down effaced our abilities to do this well ourselves. And yet there is a remarkably exciting thing about the idea that people now express themselves through blogs. They put their photographs on Flickr. And this could be a potentially transformative development for our species in a way that has the potential for a very optimistic view, even as with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there may be an extended period where there are great challenges. So I just wonder if you could comment on that aspect of this transformation.
Well, I think it's really interesting. It's really complicated. When YouTube first came out, I said, look, this is guaranteed to be a failure because, after all, it's Gresham's law. You're going to have thousands and millions of videos, the vast majority of which are going to be absolutely atrocious. No one's going to have a time to go through these. The system's going to collapse. And one of my many wrong stock bets, it didn't at all. And in fact, I still haven't heard a plausible account of how, in fact, some of these become the equivalent of folk songs. So there are what are called internet memes, or these things that pick up. And if you go on YouTube, you can find 10 million hits or 20 million hits of things that are quite remarkable. One of the famous examples last year was a song Friday, written by a young, and many of you have heard of this. It was a young girl whose parents, as a birthday present, got her a music video. This became an incredible object of ridicule. It has over 10 million hits on Facebook, not because it's a great song or a great singer under any definition, but because everyone had to see it. So there does seem to be mechanisms for the world to tell us these are the songs you should know. Same thing with folk songs. There are folk songs everybody knows, and there are songs that few people know. So to that extent, we have solved the problem of figuring out not the good from the bad, but at least the popular from the unpopular. And we don't see this uniform distribution, which was what I predicted. So somehow there are societal mechanisms that allow us to find what's important and unimportant. Now, in the realm of blogs, the vast majority of blogs are read by no one or very few people. And that's okay, because most of them are pretty bad. We have to worry about the question, though, what does determine which things will be a hit? And there's some idea that one of the reasons we build societies is to help us sort out what's good and important from that which isn't, because most of us don't have time to do that. We're now moving to a model in which it's not some institutional structure, it's some general public. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It's something that's happening. I'm probably a little less optimistic than some, but there do seem to be processes that identify things as hits and like folk songs, and they aren't the same opinion leaders. But at the same time, the major networks still have more viewership than most other things. And if you take in a few of the cable networks, they have even larger viewerships. So there is a concentration of media still. And similarly, the number of news stories that get picked up is minuscule compared to the number of news stories out there. Certainly a much smaller percentage because more people are writing the news. So I think the real problem, the real question that social scientists have to answer is, how in heck is this stuff being sorted out? And is it in a socially positive way? I think those are our two challenges. The first one seems prior, and I haven't seen any good accounts of that. I haven't seen any good accounts of how do certain songs become, how do certain things on YouTube, et cetera, certain blogs get picked up and others not.